Spring 1945. Liberation. The wind moved slowly across the barbed wire fence. The war was ending. But here, inside this camp, time had stopped years ago. A convoy of Allied trucks rolled past the rusted guard towers. The gates, once locked with military precision, now hung crooked. The smell of smoke, damp earth, and human frailty clung to everything. A column of women, thin, silent, their uniforms hanging loose on starved frames, stood waiting in the yard of Ravensbrück concentration camp. The soldiers approached carefully. They had liberated camps before, but this silence was different. No shouting, no crying, just eyes, hundreds of hollow eyes staring at them. A medic opened a crate. Inside, among bandages, tins of powdered milk, and soap, lay something unexpected, a bundle of small hand mirrors. Fettle, cold, ordinary. One by one they were handed out. A woman lifted hers. Her hands shook. She hadn't seen her own reflection in years. The face staring back at her was not the one she remembered. Hollow cheeks. Shaved head. Eyes too big for a face too small. Some gasped. Some dropped the mirrors. Others whispered nothing at all. It wasn't vanity. It was recognition. The war had taken their image, and now suddenly returned it. This moment did not happen in isolation. To understand its weight, we must return to the world that built these camps. The system that stripped these women of their reflection long before the mirrors arrived. The world that took their reflection. War does not only destroy cities. It destroys faces, names, and identities. To understand why a simple mirror could break years of silence, we must return to the beginning of the world's most devastating conflict. World War II. The year was 1939. Europe was unraveling. Wehrmacht forces surged into Poland in a storm of steel and fire. In a matter of weeks, Europe tilted toward a war unlike any before. The rapid advance of German armies across the continent triggered a cascade of occupations. Denmark, Norway, France, the Netherlands, Yugoslavia, Greece. Each conquest pulled new territories, new populations, and new prisoners into the expanding machine of war. While history often remembers the uniformed soldiers captured on battlefields, a quieter and often forgotten story was unfolding in parallel. The capture of women, military nurses, resistance members, couriers, civilians trapped behind enemy lines. Thousands of women from Poland, France, the Soviet Union, the Netherlands, Norway, and beyond were seized. Some were arrested for smuggling intelligence, some for treating the wounded, many for simply being in the wrong place. Under the rules of the Geneva Conventions of 1929, prisoners of war were supposed to receive humane treatment, medical care, and the right to maintain their identity. But reality in Nazi-occupied Europe twisted those protections beyond recognition. Female prisoners, especially those from the East, were often denied even the minimal recognition afforded to male soldiers. Many weren't even registered as POWs. They simply disappeared into a network of transit camps, forced labor sites, and special prisons. By 1941, after the invasion of the Soviet Union, mass arrests accelerated. Whole medical units of Soviet female nurses were captured alongside retreating armies. Resistance networks in France and Poland were systematically hunted down. Women became both symbols and tools in the occupiers' psychological war, unlike men, who were typically separated into military POW camps. Many women were sent to mixed facilities, civilian prisons, or specialized sites like Ravensbrück concentration camp, the largest women's camp in the Reich. Initially designed for political prisoners, Ravensbrück became a holding ground for tens of thousands of women from across occupied Europe, Polish teachers, Norwegian students, French resistance couriers, Russian partisans, nurses, even nuns. Their status blurred between prisoner of war and political captive. It was deliberate. A nameless, faceless enemy is easier to control. Upon arrival, women were stripped of personal belongings, documents, jewelry, and clothes. Their hair was shaved. Uniform garments were issued, often threadbare and infested with lice. Numbers replaced names. And mirrors, something so ordinary in civilian life, disappeared entirely. This was no accident. Removing mirrors was part of a broader system of erasing the self. Without reflection, one cannot easily track the changes of starvation or sickness. One cannot fix their hair, feel dignity, or maintain the small rituals of personal identity. This was psychological warfare, slow, invisible, and devastating. And as the war expanded, so did this machinery of dehumanization. The camps multiplied across the continent. Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Austria occupied France and Norway. Thousands of women entered this shadow world each month. Very few ever saw their own faces again. But before their silent march into camps, before the mirrors vanished, Europe itself was collapsing into darkness. And it began with the speed of a blitzkrieg. In the next part, we'll step inside those camps, into the daily reality of female POWs, where mirrors, names, and humanity were systematically stripped away. Inside the camps, erasing the self. Barbed wire did not just confine. It separated the world of the living from a slow, calculated erasure. By the early 1940s, the network of camps stretched across the map of occupied Europe like a lattice of silence. Facilities such as Ravensbrück concentration camp in Germany, Stalag Witkowski in Lower Saxony, Auschwitz concentration camp in occupied Poland, and dozens of satellite sites became holding grounds for women captured as resistance members, medical staff, partisans, and civilians. Though their official categories varied, POWs, political prisoners, forced laborers, their daily existence converged into one grim reality. Every morning began before dawn. A whistle, boots on gravel, countless figures forced into formation for appel. Roll call. The wind cut through the thin uniforms. Some women had been wearing the same piece of fabric for years. Shoes were often nothing more than wooden clogs or rags wrapped around swollen feet. There were no mirrors in the barracks, not in the wash areas, not in the infirmary. Over months and years, faces became unknown landscapes even to their owners. Hollow cheeks, cracked lips, shaven scalps, bruised skin. These were details passed by touch, not sight. Many women described after the war how they only knew their faces through the hands of others. In the absence of mirrors, their identity became a collective whisper, a shared memory of who they once were. Rations were minimal. A few hundred calories a day, a crust of bread, a ladle of watery soup. Starvation blurred not just strength but memory itself. Malnutrition collapsed the body, the mind, and eventually the sense of being someone. Hygiene was nearly non-existent. Washrooms, where they existed, were often just open basins or troughs. Soap was rare, warm water even rarer. The absence of basic hygiene created epidemics: typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis. Women who fell ill were often left untreated or transferred to punishment blocks. But the most destructive force was time. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months. Many women were held not for weeks or months but for years, sometimes the entire length of the war. In this suspended existence, the self, name, face, voice, slowly dissolved. The removal of mirrors wasn't a random cruelty. It was deliberate control. A person who cannot see herself forgets how to imagine herself. Survivors from France, Poland, and the Soviet Union would later recall how difficult it was to picture their pre-war selves. Their hair, their smiles, their youth. Some forgot the color of their eyes. Some no longer recognized each other except by voice or number tag. Even clandestine acts of defiance were stripped bare. Women used to sew tiny pockets into their garments, hiding photos or keepsakes. But in many camps, even these were discovered and confiscated during regular searches. Anything reflective was forbidden. A shard of glass could lead to punishment or worse. And yet beneath this machinery of dehumanization, a faint pulse of resistance persisted. Women carved secret combs from wood. Some whispered songs at night. Some remembered the shape of their own faces in their minds as if to fight the slow fog of oblivion. But outside the wire, the war was shifting. By 1943 and 1944, the Axis front began to fracture. The Soviet advance pushed westward. Allied bombing campaigns hammered German industry. And whispers began to spread. That liberation might come, no one knew when. No one knew how. But the machine that had stripped them of their image was cracking. And one day the gates would open. In the next part, we'll explore the many angles of this story, from the human cost to the psychological warfare behind removing mirrors, and the fragile resistance that kept identity alive in the darkest of places. The human angle. Identity without a face in war, survival is not just about food or shelter. It's about holding on to the idea of who you are. For the women imprisoned in camps like Ravensbrück concentration camp, the gradual disappearance of mirrors marked the slow dismantling of selfhood. A mirror, is an anchor. It reminds you of your existence, your age, your shape, your being. But inside the wire, women lived in a reality where they couldn't even see their own faces. Each year behind bars erased another detail. Many survivors spoke of the moment they forgot their own reflection. One French nurse, liberated in 1945, recalled that after the third year in captivity, she could no longer remember what her cheeks looked like when she smiled. Another prisoner described feeling faceless, as though she had become a number moving through the cold. This erosion of identity had profound psychological effects. Without an external reflection, many prisoners reported feeling detached from their own bodies and like shadows, not people. They described losing interest in their voices, their posture, their hair, their names. It wasn't just humiliation, it was control. A faceless prisoner is easier to break, easier to command, easier to forget, yet some resisted silently. They would braid invisible hair, press their palms against their cheeks and try to imagine the person who once lived outside the camp. A few scratched outlines of faces into the wood of their bunks, not as art, but as memory. The war took many things from them. But the mirror, its absence, and took something deeply personal, the right to remember themselves. The technological angle, the machinery of control, the camps were not improvised. They were engineered. Behind every block, tower, and barrack was a structure built for efficiency, to process human beings like logistics. Schutzstaffel administrators designed camps to eliminate unnecessary objects, and mirrors were one of the first to go. Reflective surfaces were classified as contraband, both for security and for psychological suppression. A shard of glass could be used as a weapon or signal, but it could also give someone the dangerous luxury of remembering who they were. Inside the barracks, walls were bare. Washrooms contained only communal basins. Infirmaries had no personal mirrors, no polished steel. Even utensils were made from dull tin to prevent any reflective surface. This was part of a precise layered design, to strip down individuality to pure obedience. Registration numbers replaced names. Barracks were laid out in rows identical. Routines were synchronized to the whistle. The human mind, deprived of private reflection, was absorbed into the system's mechanical rhythm. The removal of mirrors was a small detail in this vast machinery. But like every cog, it served a purpose. It kept prisoners disoriented, detached, and easier to control. The medical angle, malnutrition and the vanishing self-starvation, changes the human body in ways that are both visible and invisible. For many female prisoners, these changes happened in total darkness, unseen even by themselves. In the first months of captivity, bodies shrank rapidly. Cheeks hollowed out, ribs surfaced, menstrual cycles disappeared. Skin cracked under cold, hair fell out, gums bled from scurvy. Without mirrors, many prisoners had no idea how drastic these transformations were. Some didn't recognize their own hands. Medical records recovered after the war revealed malnutrition rates exceeding 70% in several camps. Daily rations averaged around 500–800 calories, not enough to sustain a healthy adult, let alone someone performing forced labor. Without a mirror, weight loss became an abstract sensation, not a sight. Women felt bones pressing against skin but could not see themselves disappear. In interviews decades later, many survivors described their first mirror encounter after liberation as a stranger looking back. Some turned away immediately. Others fainted. A few stared for long minutes, whispering their names to reattach identity to the unfamiliar face. For doctors and medics arriving with allied units, this moment was not just emotional, it was medical. The mirror became the first instrument in a patient's confrontation with what starvation had done. Dehumanization was not achieved by violence alone. It was achieved by precision, by removing small invisible anchors of identity until the person left inside the wire was a ghost of memory. But the absence of mirrors was not just about control. It was about dominance, about stripping prisoners of the power to see themselves as human beings. The enemy command angle, a deliberate strategy. In war, cruelty is often strategic. Inside camps like Ravensbrück concentration camp, policies were not random acts of sadism. They were structured, bureaucratic, and intentional. High-ranking officers of Schutzstaffel viewed psychological control as an essential part of camp administration. Their directives weren't only about fences and guards. They were about unmaking people, Women, especially those involved in resistance networks or medical units, were seen as dangerous because they carried morale, communication, and intelligence. Breaking their spirit made them easier to manage, interrogate, or exploit. Removing mirrors was part of this broader assault on identity. German command documents and post-war testimonies reveal how deprivation was layered. Removal of personal effects, forced uniformity, denial of individuality, controlled language, and total surveillance. Prisoners were stripped of markers of identity not because it saved resources, but because it dismantled defiance. A mirror in this environment wasn't just glass, it was power. It gave someone the ability to remember who they had been before, and for an occupying power determined to erase resistance, memory was dangerous. By removing it, enemy command created a population of women who could no longer easily connect their inner selves to the physical world. A perfect environment for domination. It was war by silence. War without gunfire. 5. The psychological angle. The mirror. Shock when liberation came and the mirrors were finally placed in their hands. The reaction was unlike any battlefield cry or gunfire exchange. It was quiet. Deafeningly quiet. For years, these women had known their faces only in imagination, fragile sketches built from memory. In those brief moments after the Allied advance of 1945, reality tore those sketches apart. The shock was immediate and profound. Psychologists who later worked with female survivors of camps like Ravensbrück described mirror trauma, the moment of first recognition after prolonged identity deprivation. Survivors reported intense emotional dissonance, disbelief, fear, numbness. Many didn't recognize themselves at all. Some thought they were looking at someone else. The features were there, eyes, mouth, bones. But the person they remembered was gone. Years of starvation, illness, and suffering had carved new faces. Age had accelerated. Youth had vanished. The mirror didn't just show their reflection. It showed what war had done to them. This moment was recorded in medical notes, Red Cross interviews, and survivor testimonies across Europe. Some women kept the mirror they received that day for decades, not as a vanity object, but as proof of survival. The first time they saw themselves again after years of darkness. The resistance angle, holding on to identity. Even in a world designed to erase them, many women fought quietly, not with rifles, but with memory. Resistance inside female POW camps took many forms. Some shared their real names secretly, whispering them at night as a way to preserve who they were. Others drew portraits of each other in the dirt with sticks, memorizing features they could not see. In Ravensbrück, a small group of Polish and French prisoners reportedly carved their initials into wooden bunk frames, so that if their faces were erased, their names would endure. A few managed to smuggle in or hide tiny shards of reflective metal, a spoon, a broken tin. These fragments became communal treasures passed from hand to hand in silence. Each woman could only look for seconds before it was hidden again. It was not vanity, it was resistance. This fragile ritual reminded them, I exist. Even when the system tried to make them faceless, they clung to identity in whatever form they could. Years later, many survivors said they didn't fight to escape. They fought to remember themselves. Through these angles, enemy command, psychological shock, and hidden resistance, the story of the mirror becomes more than a small artifact. It becomes a battlefield, a war between erasure and remembrance. And in the final months of the war, that silent battle collided with the sound of approaching armies. The gates began to open, and the mirrors returned. The winter of 1944 had been brutal, but by March 1945, the iron wall of occupation began to crack. The armies of the Allies were advancing fast from the west. Soviet forces were closing in from the east. The Reich was shrinking, its power bleeding away under the weight of defeat. And in the heart of Germany, the gates of Ravensbrück concentration camp stood waiting. The front lines were no longer distant. Distant artillery rumbled through the night like a pulse returning to a body thought dead. SS guards grew restless, burning documents, abandoning posts, preparing to flee. For the prisoners inside, the signs were unmistakable. Something was changing. Ravensbrück, once an impenetrable symbol of control, was beginning to fracture. Prisoners whispered rumors through the barracks, the Allies are near. The war is ending, but they also knew liberation could be dangerous. Many camps facing imminent capture had seen sudden killings, forced marches, or desperate attempts to cover up atrocities. No one could be certain how this story would end. Then, in April 1945, it began. Columns of exhausted guards fled the camp. Trucks rolled out under cover of night. The prisoners, starved, frail but watching, remained. They had lived under the weight of boots for years. But now, the boots were leaving. On April 30th, 1945, units from the Red Army reached the outskirts of Ravensbrück. What they found was not a battlefield. It was a cemetery of the living. More than 3,000 women, many near death, stood or lay inside the wire, some too weak to stand, some still wearing the same uniforms they had been issued years earlier. The gates were cut open. The soldiers didn't cheer. There was no victory song, just stunned silence. The women stared at them motionless. Liberation after years of degradation felt unreal. Many couldn't comprehend that the guards were gone. Some refused to step out of formation, still waiting for commands that would never come. Medical teams arrived with field kits, bandages, water, soap. And in some crates tucked among these necessities lay a small overlooked object, hand mirrors. Not intended as grand gestures, just part of personal hygiene kits distributed by Allied and Red Cross medics. But their effect was seismic. One soldier handed a mirror to a woman near the infirmary block. She looked down at it for several seconds, unsure whether to touch it. When she did, her hands shook. She lifted the mirror toward her face slowly, as if approaching a stranger. The reflection was unrecognizable. Hollow cheeks, no hair, sunken eyes, a face carved by starvation and years of fear. She gasped. Not because of vanity, but because memory collided with reality in an instant. All around, similar moments unfolded. Mirrors passed from hand to hand. Some women turned away immediately. Others stared for long, unbearable seconds. Some cried. Some didn't make a sound at all. It was the first time they had seen themselves since their arrest. This was not a celebration. It was revelation, a painful, silent confrontation between the person they remembered and the one they had become. In the official reports of Allied medics and Red Cross nurses, this moment appeared not as a headline, but as a line in medical notes. Distributed mirrors. Emotional shock observed. But for the women who held those mirrors, it was something far deeper. It was the return of a face, the return of identity. As liberation spread across Germany, similar scenes repeated themselves in other camps. Stalag 66C, Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, Auschwitz concentration camp. Thousands of women saw their faces for the first time in years. But liberation did not mean instant healing. In the following days and weeks, as mirrors and medicine mingled with fear and memory, a new kind of battle began. The battle to understand what had been lost. The mirror shock, testimonies, and silence. When the wire fell and the gates opened, it wasn't the noise of freedom that filled the camps. It was silence. Not the silence of peace. The silence of people whose voices had been locked away for years. In the weeks following the Allied and Soviet advances in the spring of 1945, liberation reports began to pile up. Medical officers, Red Cross workers, and war correspondents recorded what they saw. Not just the skeletal bodies, disease, and despair, but something else. Something quiet, almost invisible. The mirror moment. Testimony 1, Ravensbrück, May 1945-1. Polish nurse, liberated at Ravensbrück concentration camp, later described in a recorded interview how she refused to look at the mirror at first. For years she had imagined her reflection as it had been in 1939. 22 years old, long dark hair, full face, clear skin. When she finally looked, the shock felt like a wound. She said, "I did not recognize that woman. I thought someone had made a mistake. Then I saw the number on my sleeve in the glass, and I understood. It was me." Testimony 2, Bergen-Belsen, April 1945 at Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. A Dutch resistance courier held a mirror for less than 5 seconds before collapsing. Medical officers noted, patient exhibited acute emotional distress upon seeing own reflection. In later testimony, she said that in that brief moment she saw not just her face but the death of everyone she had known inside the camp. "My face," she said, "was a grave." Testimony 3, Auschwitz. January 1945, during the liberation of Auschwitz concentration camp, Soviet medical personnel distributed survival kits with soap, combs, and compact mirrors. Survivors later remembered how women passed these mirrors around like sacred objects, whispering their own names to themselves. "We were trying to convince the glass we were still alive," one Russian partisan prisoner recalled. Psychologists who later studied these testimonies referred to this phenomenon as mirror shock. It wasn't just about physical change, it was about years of disconnection. These women had lived in bodies they could feel but not see. When they finally looked, they were met not by continuity but by rupture. Some survivors screamed. Some became quiet and unresponsive for hours. Others laughed, a brittle, confused laugh that broke into tears. Many were so changed that even fellow prisoners didn't recognize them at first. Allied and Red Cross nurses described these scenes in their field notes. They noted trembling hands, refusal to look, fainting or quiet sobbing. A few women asked for water to wash their faces immediately after seeing themselves, not because they expected beauty, but because cleaning was the only way to regain a sense of self, and in some cases women simply stared. For minutes, for hours, as if trying to rebuild the missing years from the hollow face in the glass. The mirror, a small object carried in medical kits, had unintentionally become a symbol of liberation, not because it offered comfort, but because it forced the return of something the camps had stolen, identity. And yet, the return of a face did not erase the scars of what had happened. It made them visible. The mirror reflected not only a body changed by war, but also a soul forced to survive without recognition. Outside the camps, the world was celebrating victory. Flags rose over ruined cities, armies marched in triumph. But behind the fences, in the hands of women who had not seen themselves in years, the war was still unfolding inside the glass. Liberation was only the beginning. The mirror revealed the cost of survival. And in the months that followed, these women had to face a different kind of battlefield: the aftermath. The war had stretched on for years. What began as a swift German advance across Europe had grown into a global inferno. By 1942, tens of thousands of civilians, resistance fighters, and captured soldiers had disappeared behind the barbed wire of prison camps scattered across Axis-occupied territories. Many would never see the outside world again. Among them were hundreds of women, pilots, nurses, resistance couriers, and civilians caught in the machinery of war. For the Allies, the situation was both humanitarian and strategic. Female prisoners, especially those connected to military operations or intelligence networks, were seen by the Axis as potential leverage. Many were deported, hidden in remote camps, and denied even the rights outlined under Geneva Convention of 1929. Their existence was often unacknowledged in official records. No Red Cross inspections, no letters, no sunlight. One of the most brutal holding sites was Ravensbrück concentration camp in northern Germany, constructed specifically for women. It was not a standard POW camp. It was a place designed to break the body and erase the mind. More than 130,000 women from over 40 countries were imprisoned here between 1939 and 1945. Resistance fighters from France, Poland, Soviet Union, and Netherlands were held here. Many were subjected to forced labor in armament factories, working day and night under freezing conditions. Their reflection in a mirror, if one existed at all, was replaced by the empty stare of other emaciated faces. While some female POWs were placed in camps under military jurisdiction, like Stalag Luft III or Oflag 90C, many others were swept into concentration systems after accusations of espionage or resistance activity. Women captured while working as underground couriers in Poland and France often found themselves transferred to such camps under secret orders. There were no uniforms for these women, only rags, lice, and the constant stench of disease. By 1944, the physical condition of most female prisoners had deteriorated beyond recognition. Malnutrition stripped away muscle and skin. Many prisoners, especially in eastern camps, had not seen their own reflection in over 3 years. Mirrors were banned. Glass shards were confiscated. Identity, both individual and collective, was deliberately erased. Even hair was shorn to the scalp. The Allied advance across Europe in 1944 brought a faint glimmer of hope. As the United States Army pushed through France and the Soviet Red Army approached from the east, German administrators began dismantling smaller camps and transporting prisoners deeper into the Reich. This was the era of death marches. Tens of thousands of prisoners, including women, were forced to walk hundreds of kilometers in winter with almost no food or water. Those who collapsed were shot by the roadside. The war's strategic map changed dramatically in early 1945. Berlin was under siege. Allied forces were closing in from all directions. Camps began to empty in chaos. For the first time in years, a thin line between captivity and liberation emerged, but liberation did not bring immediate joy. When Allied troops arrived at camps like Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, Dachau concentration camp, and Ravensbrück, they encountered scenes almost beyond comprehension. Women who had once been pilots, doctors, mothers, and soldiers now weighed little more than children. Lice crawled in their hair. Their clothes hung from their bones. Many could not walk. Many could no longer speak. The moment that inspired the title of this story comes from these very first days after liberation. Allied medical units, accustomed to treating combat wounds, were not prepared for what they saw here. The priority was survival: food, water, delousing, and medical stabilization. Yet something else happened, something profoundly human. When camp survivors were brought into medical triage stations, some of the nurses offered them small hand mirrors to help with grooming. It was not a strategic gesture, just a human one. Many of the women stared into the glass for minutes without speaking. Others dropped it, trembling. They no longer recognized the person they saw. A few broke down in tears. Others simply turned away in silence. This was not vanity. This was identity rediscovered after years of being erased. For many, the face in the mirror was the face of someone they had never seen, older, starved, scarred. It was the face of survival. And yet behind that reflection lay the deeper story, the years that led to this moment, the hidden resistance networks, the policies of imprisonment, and the silent endurance of thousands of women behind the barbed wire. That story had begun long before the mirror was handed to them, and it would forever change the world's understanding of war, captivity, and the human will to endure. The quiet tremor of that first reflection was not the end of their war. It was only the beginning of what came after. The human dimension. Silent endurance war narratives often speak of armies, battles, and leaders. But here, the front line was a woman's body and mind. Inside camps like Ravensbrück concentration camp, survival was not about winning ground. It was about surviving each hour. No newspapers, no calendars, only the cold rhythm of forced labor, illness, and hunger. For years, thousands of female POWs and deportees endured in silence. Many were resistance members captured after courier missions in France and Poland. Others were nurses, medics, or civilians caught during evacuations. They had been mothers, students, teachers, stripped of everything that had once anchored them. Without mirrors, their faces became distant memories. They relied on each other to understand what they looked like. Your cheekbones are sharper. Your hair is falling out. But there was no true reflection, no self. This was precisely what their captors intended. Erasing identity meant erasing resistance. Yet beneath the skeletal frames and shaven heads, identity never fully disappeared. It became something inward, something shared between those who refused to be broken. At night, when the camp grew quiet, some women whispered their real names. Not the numbers tattooed or sewn onto their rags. Their real names. To remember who they were. This quiet defiance, once invisible to the world, became one of the most powerful forms of resistance in the entire war. Tactical and political. Why female POWs? Where hidden female POWs represented a unique challenge to the Axis command. Under the Geneva Convention of 1929, captured nurses and female auxiliaries were supposed to be treated as non-combatants. But the Nazi system blurred lines between political prisoner, resistance fighter, and soldier. Women who had joined underground intelligence networks or partisan movements were not granted POW status. They were labeled saboteurs, spies, or traitors, and those labels stripped them of every protection under international law. This was why so many disappeared without a trace. Camps such as Ravensbrück concentration camp and Auschwitz concentration camp were never officially marked as POW facilities. They were black sites of the Nazi system. While men were exchanged, registered, or occasionally repatriated through neutral countries, women often vanished from the paperwork entirely. Their silence served a tactical purpose. It denied the Allies a bargaining chip. It erased evidence of political resistance. And it kept the existence of large-scale female networks in occupied Europe hidden for as long as possible. The system was methodical. Many captured couriers in France were interrogated, transported in sealed convoys, and dispersed across multiple camps to avoid creating organized resistance behind the wire. Their names would later resurface only in the records of liberation. This hidden tactical layer explains why so many survivors were stunned when they finally saw a mirror. Because for years, the world had not only denied their face, it had denied their existence. Technological, the machinery of erasure war is often fought with tanks and aircraft. But in the concentration camp system, technology was used not only to kill, but to erase barbed wire electrified, guard towers with searchlights, mass transportation via convoys and freight trains, rationing systems designed to break metabolism over time. Female prisoners were forced to work in armaments factories run by companies like Siemens. They assembled parts for weapons they would never see used. The entire process was designed to convert human beings into expendable labor units. Mirrors, makeup, even soap. These were seen as unnecessary. Reflective surfaces were confiscated. Women were deliberately stripped of all personal objects upon arrival. Even hair was removed to standardize their appearance. This technological depersonalization extended to records. Names became numbers on cards. Faces disappeared from official files. Many women who died were cremated with no documentation. This was the industrialized annihilation of identity. And yet the mirror that would be handed to them after liberation, a small, cold piece of glass, cut through that entire machinery in an instant. It returned to them something the Nazis had spent years trying to erase. And then, with the war's end, humanity handed them a simple object that said, "You are still here. You still exist. You are seen." This was not a military victory. It was a human one. The nurses who handed out mirrors at liberation were not strategists or commanders. They were ordinary people performing quiet acts of dignity. But in the landscape of war, those small acts can weigh more than the sound of artillery. The moment when the mirror returned a face to its owner is a moment when humanity quietly triumphed over the machinery of erasure. It's where this story shifts from endurance, tactics, and dehumanization toward a decisive moment that would define the end of the war for thousands of women. The mirror was more than glass. It was truth. And that truth would meet history head-on when the camps finally fell, and the women stepped into the light again. Spring, 1945. The European continent trembled as the Third Reich began to collapse. Cities burned. Rail lines cracked under retreating convoys. Camps that had been hidden for years were suddenly exposed to the world. On the morning of April 30th, 1945, the gates of Ravensbrück concentration camp were opened to advancing forces of the Soviet Red Army. The women who staggered forward were almost unrecognizable as the people they once had been. Many wore torn blankets instead of clothing. Some weighed barely 30 kilograms. Others had lost their ability to walk. The camp that had once been a machine of silence now echoed with the sound of liberation. The soldiers who entered that morning were not prepared for what they saw. Behind the rows of electrified wire lay skeletal figures, thousands of women from more than 20 nations. The air reeked of disease, smoke, and fear. The crematorium was still warm. Prisoners lay in open barracks, wrapped in straw mats, barely breathing. The war was technically days away from ending, but for these women, it ended in that instant. Liberation, however, was not a single moment. It was a process, slow, chaotic, fragile. Allied and Soviet medical units moved into camps to establish field hospitals. Doctors and nurses set up triage stations in nearby villages, school buildings, and abandoned barracks. Their mission: stabilize as many survivors as possible. For many of these women, their first contact with the outside world came not from politicians or soldiers, but from nurses. At these stations, survivors were given food, cautiously because refeeding too quickly could kill. They were deloused, bathed, wrapped in clean linen, and then came something no military order had planned: small acts of humanity, a comb, a warm cup of broth, and sometimes a mirror. The first documented mirror distributions occurred in makeshift medical facilities set up near Ravensbrück and Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. Allied nurses, trying to help survivors wash and dress, handed them small hand mirrors to fix their hair or wipe their faces. They expected a practical reaction. Instead, silence. One nurse from the British Army later wrote in her field notes, "When we handed the women the mirrors, many froze. Some touched their faces as if it belonged to someone else. A few cried quietly. One woman whispered, 'Who is this?' For the first time in years, the prisoners saw themselves. And the reflection looking back was not the young nurse, courier, or mother who had been taken. It was a face carved by hunger, disease, and war. For some, the mirror was too much. Nurses recorded cases of women setting the mirror down gently, refusing to look again. Others clutched it tightly as if afraid it might be taken away. One survivor from Warsaw would later testify in a post-war hearing, "I did not know my own face. I thought perhaps they had given me someone else's reflection." But this was not a moment of defeat. It was the moment they understood what they had survived. The mirror was not showing them their weakness. It was showing them their endurance. Logistically, the liberation of Ravensbrück was chaotic. Tens of thousands of prisoners had already been forced on death marches toward other camps in the weeks before the Red Army arrived. But an estimated 3,000 women remained. Many were Polish resistance fighters, French couriers, Soviet partisans, and political prisoners. They were scattered, starving, and deeply ill. Allied medical reports documented extreme malnutrition, typhus outbreaks, gangrene, and widespread psychological trauma. But behind every chart and record was a person whose name had been erased, whose reflection had been taken away. The first sight of themselves was also the first step toward reclaiming their identity. The enemy's view, control through dehumanization. To understand why this moment was so powerful, one must see the war through the cold, strategic lens of the oppressor. For Nazi officials and camp administrators, female prisoners represented more than just bodies. They represented narratives that needed to be controlled. The regime feared the power of female resistance movements in occupied territories. Women had played key roles in courier operations, intelligence smuggling, and underground medical aid. Their networks were mobile, discreet, and often invisible to standard military surveillance. The solution was dehumanization. Not loud brutality, but systematic stripping away of identity. A woman without a name, without hair, without a reflection was easier to control, easier to erase from memory, easier to deny existed. Dehumanization was not just cruelty, it was strategy. By turning these women into nameless shadows, the Nazi state maintained the illusion of control over occupied Europe. It reinforced the message that resistance, especially female resistance, would not only be crushed but erased from history. But history had other plans. And so did the women who endured. This war was not only fought with guns and tanks. It was fought through memory, identity, and silence. For the women who survived, the simple act of holding a mirror would become the moment when the war's most intimate battle was finally revealed. The fight to reclaim the self. Their endurance, erasure, and defiance set the stage for the moment the front lines broke and the camps were opened. Leadership and responsibility. A forgotten front. While much of the world's attention during the war focused on grand strategies and famous generals, the leadership behind the treatment of female POWs tells a darker, quieter story. The chain of command that governed places like Ravensbrück concentration camp and other female camps ran through both military and political structures, merging SS control with state bureaucracy. Officials in Schutzstaffel and the Gestapo signed off on transport, orders that sent thousands of women to hidden sites without formal registration. This lack of paperwork wasn't negligence, it was intent. At the top, leaders such as Heinrich Himmler saw female prisoners as security threats rather than POWs. This mindset stripped them of rights and gave local camp commanders free rein to control, exploit, and erase them. The bureaucratic machinery turned human lives into logistical problems. Boxes to be moved, numbers to be filed, yet the story doesn't end there. In the final months of the war, some camp administrators tried to destroy evidence of their involvement, burning records, emptying files, and executing prisoners who could testify. But they could not erase the survivors, and those survivors would one day speak, forcing the world to confront the leadership decisions that tried to bury them. The mirror moment, when these women saw their own faces again, was also a moment of exposure. It revealed not just what they had become, but what had been done to them. Psychological impact. The first glance, it's difficult to imagine what it means to not see your own reflection for years. For many women, the absence of mirrors had quietly rewired their relationship with themselves. They no longer recognized their own hands. Their faces existed only as a vague memory from another lifetime. When a mirror was finally placed in their hands in 1945, liberation collided with reality. The first glance was not joy, it was shock. Hollow cheeks, sunken eyes, aged skin. Some whispered, "And that's not me." Others said nothing at all. Psychologists and allied doctors documented this reaction in medical reports. They noted cases of women refusing to look again, or turning the mirror face down on the table. It wasn't vanity. It was the psychological fracture of being forcibly separated from one's own image. For years, identity had been something shared, whispered, remembered, passed hand to hand like a smuggled message. Now it was staring back at them, fragile and undeniable. In that moment, many survivors later said, they understood the full weight of what the war had done, not just to their bodies, but to their sense of self. A mirror, in this case, was not a simple object. It was a confrontation with the war itself, cultural silence, the erasure of women's POW stories after the war. The world wanted to move forward, rebuild, heal. But in this rush, many of the stories of female POWs and deportees faded from the mainstream narrative. The history books focused on male soldiers, generals, tanks, and major battles. Women's imprisonment often sat in the margins, mentioned briefly if at all. This cultural silence was shaped by both trauma and society's expectations. Many female survivors were discouraged from speaking openly about what they endured. Some returned home to countries that celebrated victory, but had no space to process female suffering. The image of the mirror moment was rarely shown in post-war newsreels. There were few photographs. Few testimonies made it into early documentaries. Their war was quiet, internal, and often unrecorded. Yet decades later, survivor testimonies began to emerge in trials, memoirs, and oral history projects. Their accounts revealed the missing half of the POW narrative, the suffering, endurance, and resilience of women who had been deliberately erased. The mirror became a symbol not just of liberation, but of reclamation. It forced history to look back at faces it had long ignored. Angle 8. The moral weight, humanity against machinery. In the end, the mirror scene carries a moral weight far beyond the surface. This war was fought with unimaginable brutality. Yet, in that small act, handing a woman a mirror, the moral contrast between the oppressor and the liberator became visible. For years, the Nazi system had reduced women to numbers, erased their reflections, and tried to bury their existence. Outside the camps, the war was unraveling in real time. Berlin was collapsing. Adolf Hitler was dead. The German army was surrendering piece by piece. But inside the walls of Ravensbrück, the true measure of victory was not on a battlefield. It was in a quiet room where a woman lifted a mirror for the first time in years and saw that she had outlived the Reich. The symbolism was powerful. The machinery of erasure had failed. The human spirit had not. Liberation did not immediately heal the wounds. But it cracked open the silence the Nazis had built around these women. And through that crack, their faces, their real faces, returned to history. What followed in the hours and days after this moment would shape their fate. Evacuation, medical treatment, and the difficult path toward recovery. The war outside had ended. But for these survivors, their personal war was still unfolding. The first days after liberation were a blur of motion. Trucks rolled through mud. Stretchers lined up along village roads. Triage tents went up overnight. For the survivors of Ravensbrück concentration camp, freedom came wrapped in bandages and silence. Medical officers from the Soviet Red Army and later the British Army and American Red Cross worked side by side to save lives that hung by a thread. It wasn't glamorous. There were no speeches. only the overwhelming task of keeping human beings alive after years of systematic starvation. Liberation was not a clean break from the past. It was a collision between two worlds, one of barbed wire and silence, and one that still had mirrors, clean clothes, food, and light. In some makeshift clinics, nurses placed buckets of warm water on tables, trying to help women wash the lice and dirt from their skin. They brought combs, soap, small towels, and whenever possible, mirrors. It was a simple gesture, never planned in military briefings, but it would become one of the most emotionally powerful moments of the entire liberation. A nurse from the British Army later recalled in her diary, "When we handed her the mirror, she stopped breathing for a second. Her eyes widened. She touched her face like it belonged to someone else. Then the tears came, quietly, almost politely, as if she didn't want to disturb anyone." Another wrote, "They stared not in vanity but in disbelief. It was as if the war was speaking back to them." These moments were repeated again and again, in village schools turned into hospitals, in military trucks carrying survivors to evacuation centers, in rooms where broken women looked at their own faces and finally saw how far they had come. For some, the reflection triggered a flood of memories. Before the camp, before the numbers, before the silence, the mirror became a bridge back to the person they once were, and a painful reminder of everything lost. These were not isolated reactions. Psychological observers accompanying medical units documented widespread identity shock. Many women did not immediately recognize themselves. Their hair had been shaved or fallen out. Their faces were skeletal. Their eyes were sunken deep. They looked older than their years, some by decades. Many turned the mirror face down after the first glance, as if to protect what was left inside. One Soviet medic described the moment as more powerful than gunfire. You could see in their faces that the war had carved itself into their bones. The mirror moment also exposed something else: how differently women had experienced captivity compared to male POWs. While men were often recorded, listed, and exchanged through formal channels, many of these women had been invisible to the world. Their liberation was not anticipated on any Allied roster. Their names were missing from lists. Their faces had not been photographed in years, and so the mirror became the first official confirmation that they still existed. Meanwhile, outside the hospitals, the war was ending. Berlin had fallen. Karl Donitz had announced Germany's surrender. But inside the camps and hospitals, liberation felt less like victory, and more like waking up from a nightmare. Some survivors tried to smile at their reflections. Some whispered their names out loud as if trying to reconnect with their own voice. Others stayed silent, lost in the weight of what they saw. Repatriation efforts began in early May 1945. Trains and convoys were organized to return survivors to France, Poland, Netherlands, and the Soviet Union. But for many, home no longer existed. Families were gone. Cities were reduced to rubble. The face in the mirror had outlived everything else. Many survivors carried the mirror with them as they left. A piece of glass became their first personal possession after years of imprisonment. To some, it was a symbol of rebirth. To others, a reminder of the person they no longer recognized. In military archives, the mirror isn't listed in supply manifests or strategy documents. It doesn't appear in official liberation photographs as often as the flags or the soldiers. But in the testimonies of women who lived through the camps, it appears again and again. A French courier who spent 3 years in Ravensbrück later wrote, "The war ended the day I saw my face. I did not recognize her, but she was alive. That was the turning point. Not a single battle, not a treaty, not a surrender, but a reflection. A quiet, personal confrontation that revealed what war had taken and what it could never destroy. This was where the world outside began to meet the world inside the camps. And from this moment forward, nothing, not the victors, not the history books, not the silence, could ever erase what these women had endured. The battles had ended, but their war, the war of memory, of healing, of identity, was just beginning. They had survived the unimaginable: starvation, disease, silence. For years, they were stripped of everything: uniforms, rank, dignity, even the simple act of looking into a mirror. But when those mirrors were finally returned, it was not just their faces they saw. They saw time, they saw war, The mirror became a battlefield of its own, not of guns and bombs, but of memory. The lines on their cheeks told stories of endless roll calls, of monsoon rains leaking through barrack roofs, of Christmases spent in darkness. Their sunken eyes carried the weight of a war fought not just on the front lines but in the cages of captivity. For the nurses of World War II, beauty had long ceased to matter. Survival had been their only mirror, and yet, seeing themselves again, older, thinner, transformed, was a moment that history books rarely record. Across continents, similar scenes unfolded. British, Dutch, Australian, American. Women who had entered the war in crisp uniforms now emerged gaunt and aged beyond their years. Liberation did not erase the years stolen, but it gave them something else. A name, a story, a face in the mirror. Their reflection was proof. Proof they had lived through it. Proof they had not been forgotten. In the quiet aftermath of war, these women returned home to nations rebuilding. Their stories were often buried beneath headlines of battles and treaties. Yet their endurance, silent and unshakable, became a testament to another front of the war, one fought without guns, but with unbroken spirit. In every wrinkle, every hollowed cheekbone lay a chapter of resistance. Their mirrors were not just glass. They were history, because the war didn't just end with the sound of victory. It ended when they finally saw themselves again.